Hello everyone. This presentation series is about the macro and microeconomic impacts of a Middle East energy shock in Iran, especially when conflict or disruption pushes oil and gas prices sharply higher. Energy is not just another commodity, it is a core input into transport, electricity, manufacturing, logistics, and household consumption. So when oil and gas prices rise, the effects spread quickly across the whole economy. In this series, I will trace the chain from oil market disruption to inflation, weaker growth, stagflation, and wider global financial stress. I will also examine why the effects differ between oil importing and oil exporting countries, and why policymakers often face very difficult choices during such shocks. I will also go through some very important reactions from individual countries and the specific impact to their economy. This slide introduces the central idea: a regional energy disruption can become a global economic problem. This lecture series contains several sections. Its main focus is the oil shock associated with Iran conflict, together with an analysis of the related macroeconomic and microeconomic series and their global consequences. The key learning outcomes for the series are as follows: explain how oil shocks affect inflation, output, and unemployment using economic series. Explain the role of OPEC, the Strait of Hormuz, and risk premiums in shaping oil prices. Assess why oil importing and oil exporting economies are affected differently. Analyze the ripple effects of Iran oil crisis across the global economy. Examine how individual countries such as the US, Iran, India, China, Russia respond to and manage oil-related issues and crises. The first section builds the foundation of this lecture. I will start with how the oil market works, then define oil shocks and oil crises, and finally show how oil price moves feed into inflation, output, and GDP growth. The topic in section 1 include oil market basics, production, oil shocks versus oil crisis, microeconomic impacts, demand and supply, price elasticity, volatility, and risk premium, macroeconomic impacts, inflation, AS versus AD, stagflation, interest rates, petrodollar exchange rate and financial channels, impact on importing versus exporting countries, historical examples and cases comparison. First, some oil basics. Crude oil is a raw fossil fuel extracted from underground reservoirs. The differences between crude oil and petroleum products is that crude oil must be refined into products such as gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and petrochemicals. Oil is therefore both an energy source and an industry input. Disruption in crude oil markets affects transport, manufacturing, food, and chemical, and many other industries. Oil has three main global benchmarks because oil extracted are not the same across the world. The main three benchmarks are Brent, WTI, and Dubai Oman. They act as reference prices for crude oil traded in different parts of the world. Brent from the North Sea is the most widely used global benchmark. WTI from the United States is lighter and sweeter and is often seen as very high quality. Dubai Oman is more relevant for Middle Eastern crude sold into Asian markets. The key point is that oil is not priced as one single global product. Different crude types have different qualities, locations, and market uses. That's why geopolitical shocks may affect these benchmarks differently, with Brent often reacting more strongly to Middle East disruption. Crude oil is not a uniform commodity. Different grades vary in density and sulfur content, and many refineries are built for specific types. That means a disruption in Middle Eastern crude cannot always be solved simply by switching to another source overnight. This creates refining bottlenecks and can widen price pressure beyond the crude itself. A crude shortage can become a fuel shortage if refineries cannot easily switch grades. This slide shows crude oil production. Production concentration matters because shocks in major producers affect global supply. It reminds us that crude oil production is very concentrated in a relatively small number of countries. Because supply is geographically uneven, disruption in one major producing region can have global price effects. Middle Eastern producers remain central because of their large reserves and export capacity. This concentration makes geopolitical disruption especially important for global supply. Oil markets are therefore shaped by both economics and strategy. The major crude oil production are from some major countries. As shown in the left panel, these are Canada, China, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and United States. Global oil production leadership has shifted over time. The United States rose sharply after the shale revolution, overtaking Saudi Arabia and Russia. Iran remains an important producer, but at a much lower level, with output affected by sanctions and geopolitical pressures. This slide highlights changing energy power, market competition, and the strategic importance of production capacity across the globe. Oil prices are usually discussed through benchmark crude such as Brent, WTI, and Dubai Oman as we discussed earlier. These benchmark prices matter because they shape transport costs, production cost, inflation, and the wider stability of the global economy. The oil price reflects both market fundamentals and geopolitical risk. Price movements affect inflation, production cost, and macroeconomic level stability. Oil is therefore one of the most important global strategic prices. This slide shows oil market supply and demand. In the short run, both oil demand and oil supply are relatively inelastic. Consumers cannot quickly stop using energy, and producers cannot quickly expand output. This is why even a small supply disruption can generate very large price increases. The figure shows one oil demand curve in blue and three supply curves by time horizon. In the very short run, the orange-colored line, supply is almost vertical, showing in this color, so shocks mainly change price. In the short run, supply is steeper but responsive, showing in the green color. In the long run, supply is flatter, means more elastic, so quantity adjusts more and price move less. Oil markets are not only about production, they also depend on shipping, insurance, port access, and maritime routes. If war risk insurance is withdrawn or ships are rerouted, effective supply falls even if some oil is still being produced. This is one reason why choke points, such as the Strait of Hormuz, matter so much. They are critical to global oil flows safely, smoothly, and at low cost. Conflict or blockade can raise freight costs, insurance premiums, and delivery times. Longer routes reduce effective shipping capacity and tighten the market further. This can also cause the multiplier effects. High freight rates act as a hidden tax on all seaborne commodities, including grain, oil, retail goods, and chemical fertilizers, and so on, feeding the bullwhip effect across the global economy. This slide shows the global oil supply choke points, highlighting where a large share of maritime oil trade passes through narrow routes. Global oil trade relies heavily on a few maritime choke points, making the system vulnerable to disruption. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important, carrying about 20.9 million barrels per day in 2023, followed by the Strait of Malacca at 23.7. Other major routes include the Suez Canal, the Turkish Strait, Danish Straits, Panama Canal, and the Cape of Good Hope. This shows that tensions around Iran and Israel recently raised fears over Hormuz, where any closure could sharply increase oil prices, disrupt liquid natural gas trade, and affect many of the Asian importers, including China, Japan, South Korea, and India. The Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia is the world's busiest oil choke point. What is an oil crash? An oil crash is not just a sudden oil shock, but a wider period of instability in the oil market. It usually begins with a disruption, then spreads through the higher prices, shortages, panic, and slower economic growth. The diagram shows how oil prices often move sharply around major geopolitical and economic events, such as wars, financial crisis, sanctions, and COVID-19, showing the strong link between risk events and oil market volatility. In the diagram, the black line shows oil price movements over time, while the blue vertical line marked major risk event. It suggests that oil prices are highly sensitive to geopolitical conflict, natural disasters, and so on. It shows that oil prices do not change randomly. They often react to major world events, which is why oil crises can last beyond the initial shock. In comparison, an oil supply shock is a sudden event itself, a sharp fall or rise in oil supply that quickly changes prices. Again, wars, sanctions, embargoes, or output cut usually create negative shocks and push prices up. An oil crisis is broader and longer, covering the wider consequences after the shock, including shortage, inflation, recession, panic, and political instability over time. Using two diagrams, this slide shows why oil shocks are usually more severe in the short run than in the long run. A negative supply shock shifts the supply left from S0 to S1 in the left panel. The short run, both demand and supply are relatively inelastic, so even a modest fall in supply causes a sharp rise in price from P0 to P1 and a fall in quantity from Q0 to Q1. In the right panel, the long run, both producers and consumers have more time to adjust through investment, efficiency, and substitution. Because demand and supply become more elastic, the same shock causes a smaller price increase and a less extreme market response. Overall, the key message is that oil markets are far more volatile in the short run, while long-run adjustment helps soften the impact. Again, oil prices are highly volatile because in the short run, the oil market is tight and both demand and supply are relatively inelastic. As a result, even small disruptions can lead to a large price movements. Wars, sanctions, transport bottlenecks, and other oil shocks all add friction to the system. Even when physical oil continues to flow, rerouting shipments, higher insurance and freight costs, storage behavior, and uncertainty in future can all push price higher. So oil prices respond not only to actual changes in supply and demand, but also to expectations about future risk. In the short run, households and firms cannot easily cut oil use or switch to substitutes, so the price effect is amplified. Over time, substitution into electric vehicles, renewable energy, and efficiency improvements become more possible, but this adjustment is gradual rather than immediate. This diagram illustrates how sanctions act as a negative supply shock in both the short run and the long run. The blue line represents demand. In the short run, the supply curve is steeper and shifts left from SR0 to SR1, moving equilibrium from ESR0 to ESR1. Quantity falls from about 32 to 24, while price rises from about 92 to 98. This shows how short-run inelasticity causes even a relatively small disruption to produce a strong price response. In the long run, the supply curve is flatter and shifts from LR0 to LR1. Equilibrium moves from ELR0 to ELR1, with quantity falling more moderately from about 61 to 55 and price rising from about 65 to 70. This reflects gradual adjustment through rerouting, efficiency gains, substitution, and investment. Overall, the key message is that short-run elasticity magnifies oil price movements, while sanctions, logistical friction, and market expectations make prices even more unstable. Long-run adjustment helps reduce the severity of the shock, but it does not remove it completely. A risk premium breakdown of oil price is used to show how much of the oil price comes from normal market fundamentals and how much comes from geopolitical risk, supply fears, and transport disruption. This page shows that oil prices contain more than the basic supply and demand price. A risk premium breakdown separates the normal market value from actual cost caused by shortage, geopolitical tension, shipping disruption, insurance risk, and uncertainty. It helps us understand why oil prices can rise sharply even when physical supply has not completely stopped in global market. For example, if Brent rises from $65 to $120, not all of that increase necessarily reflects a pure physical shortage. Part may come from a tighter supply, part from war risk, and part from shipping and insurance disruption. This helps us understand why oil prices can jump very quickly before full physical shortage. This slide shows the breakdown of risk premium. The $120 oil price can be broken into separate parts. The base market value is 65. The 25 for supply tightness, 20 for geopolitical risk, and 10 for shipping and insurance disruption. Altogether, these premiums equal to 55, 65, and give a final price of 120 here. An oil shock affects the whole economy. On the microeconomic side, oil demand is relatively elastic in the short run but firms then face higher production and transport costs, causing marginal costs to rise and output to fall. Also, some firms may switch to alternative energy resources. This adjustment usually takes time. On the macroeconomic side, higher oil prices can generate cost-push inflation, reduce households' real income, lower output, and weaken aggregate demand. They can also disrupt the traditional Phillips curve trade-off, creating the possibility of a stagflation. This slide also suggests that OPEC's behavior can be understood through game theory. These are a quick summary of the microeconomic and macroeconomic theories could be involved in an oil shock event. To explain a little bit about ripple effects. The ripple effect of rising global oil price over about 1 to 2 years. First, an oil price surge quickly rises headline inflation because fuel, energy, and transport costs increase almost immediately. This is the months 0 to 3. Next, in months 3 to 9, the shock spreads through the economy. Firms face higher input cost, profit margin is squeezed, and manufacturing activity weakens. This is often seen in a fall in PMI. Then in months 6 to 18, relatively long term, central banks start to respond to persistent inflation by raising interest rates. So the overall pattern is oil shock leads to inflation rise, lead to business slowdown, lead to policy tightening. The main message is that oil price increases do not only hurt consumers at the pump. They create a delayed macroeconomic chain reaction across inflation, production, and monetary policy. Another diagram to summarize the main effect of higher oil price on the whole economy. Central idea is when oil prices rise, oil becomes a more expensive input for many sectors, including mainly transport, electricity and fuel, manufacturing, agricultural, logistics. Because oil is used across many sectors, the effect spreads throughout the whole economy. For consumer, households pay more for petrol, heating, transport, and goods, so their cost of living rises and living standard may fall. For inflation, firms face higher production and transport costs, so prices rise. This is called cost-push inflation. For current account, oil importing countries, the import bill rises, so the current account deficit may worsen. Economic growth, higher costs reduce spending and production, so economic growth may slow down. Regarding investment, firms may delay or reduce investment because costs rise and profits become more uncertain. Alternatives, consumer and firms may try to switch to substitutes. Electric vehicles, renewables become popular, or energy-saving technology being pushed forward into practice. Now we move into macroeconomics. Compared with microeconomic demand and supply curves we looked at above, which focus on the oil market itself and explained why short-run elasticity causes sharp price increases. This slide moves to the wider macroeconomic picture. In the ASAD framework, an active oil shock raises production and transport cost across the economy, so short-run AS shifts left. As the result, the general price level rises while real output falls. This means the economy experiences inflation and weaker growth at the same time. This is the classic stagflation outcome. The key difference in this curve with the short run and long run macroeconomic curve is that the macroeconomic curve explains the market mechanism, while this slide explains the economy-wide consequences and policy dilemma. Oil shocks raise inflation through both direct and indirect channels. Households face higher fuels, gas, electricity, and so on, while firms face rising production, distribution, and logistics costs. These higher costs spread beyond the energy sector, creating cost-push inflation and potentially making inflation persist through wages and expectations. Major oil shocks often intensify inflation rather than start from zero. Across 4 episodes showing in this diagram, the 1973 to 1974 oil shock, the 1979 shock, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the 2025 to 2026 Iran-related tensions. Inflation in the UK, US, and Australia are shown here has already started. So before the oil prices spiked, the black line shows oil prices surge after each geopolitical event, while the colored CPI lines show inflation had already been climbing. The main message is that oil shocks usually worsen existing inflationary pressure, pushing prices even higher rather than being the sole original cause of inflation in this economy. Stagflation. An oil shock can create stagflation, which means higher inflation, lower output, and higher unemployment at the same time. When oil prices rise sharply, firms face higher transport, heating, and production costs. This shifts short-run SRAS left, so the economy produces less while the general price level rises. At the same time, households lose real purchasing power because more income is spent on fuel and energy, so demand for other goods weakens. This makes stagflation especially difficult for policymakers, because measures to reduce inflation may worsen unemployment, while measures to boost growth may increase inflation. So this shows in these two figures. ASAD diagram. The SRAS curve shifts left from SRAS1 to SRAS2. Equilibrium moves from Y1 P1 to Y2 P2. This shows real GDP falling and the price level rise. The lower bottom figure is the Phillips curve diagram. The short-run Phillips curve shifts outward. Normally, inflation and unemployment move in opposite directions, but after an oil shock, both can rise together. This is the stagflation trap. A useful historical example from 2004 to 2008 shows how a prolonged rise in oil prices can generate stagflationary pressure. Strong global demand pushed oil price steadily higher, and by 2008, those energy costs had begun to act like a tax on both production and consumption, placing increasing pressure on the wider economy. This episode developed in two stages. First, the rise in oil prices was mainly demand-driven. Rapid industrialization in more developing countries increased global demand for oil faster than supply could expand. In the first diagram, the demand shifts right from D1 to D2, the diagram above, while supply remains steep at S1. Because oil supply is relatively inelastic in the short run, quantity increases only slightly from Q1 to Q2, but price rises sharply from around $35 to roughly $140 per barrel. The lower level diagram, once oil became extremely expensive, it turned into a cost shock for the wider economy. In the second diagram below, higher fuel, energy, and transport costs shift short-run aggregate supply left from S1 to S2. This raises the overall price level from P1 to P2 and reduces output from Q1 to Q2. This is the essence of stagflation, i.e., higher inflation combined with lower output. Overall, the key lesson is that an oil boom can begin as a demand-driven surge in the oil market, but later spread through the wider economy as a negative supply shock. One important caution, however, is that higher oil prices intensified the 2008 crisis rather than single-handedly causing it. They added to the strain on an already fragile, highly leveraged U.S. economy and helped worsen recessionary pressure. The 2008 oil shock pushed inflation up at first, but then the global financial crisis pushed demand down so hard that inflation fell quickly, which is shown in this diagram. After 2008, inflation did not fall as much as the traditional Philip curve models predicted. Even with severe recession and rising unemployment, inflation remained more persistent than expected, suggesting that the relationship between unemployment and inflation had become weaker or flatter. The solid line is actual inflation. The other lines are Philip curve type forecasts based on the unemployment gap and output gap. Those forecast lines expected inflation to fall more deeply than it actually did. This figure suggests that although recession and unemployment increased, inflation did not fall as much as older model predicted. Impact of oil supply shock. An oil price rise affects countries differently depending on whether they are net energy importers or net energy exporters. The diagrams here compares median response over time across 4 indicators: real GDP, consumer prices, nominal interest rates, and exchange rates. The figure shows for net energy importing economies such as the US, Euro area, Japan, and Switzerland, the shock generally reduces real GDP, raises consumer prices, and often push interest rate upward. This reflects stagflationary pressure, weaker growth combined with higher inflation. For net energy exporting economies such as Norway and Canada, the effects are more favorable. Real GDP tends to rise or hold up better because higher oil prices increase export revenues. Their currency may also strengthen. Inflationary pressure is usually weaker or more temporary. The main message is that the same oil shock creates economic strain for importers but can generate income and exchange rate gains for exporters. Australia and the UK show mixed effects because their broader energy positions are more complex. The petrodollar and the dollar oil nexus. Since the 1970s, most global oil trade has been priced in US dollars. This means an oil shock is not only an energy event, it can also become a monetary and financial shock, especially for countries that must import energy and repay debt in dollars. Since the 1970s, most global oil trade has been priced in US dollars. This creates persistent global demand for US dollar in energy market. When oil price rise, oil importing countries must spend more dollars on energy. A stronger dollar can increase debt serving cost in countries with US dollar-dominated debt. So an oil shock can become both an energy shock and a financial shock. Higher oil means higher interest rates. When oil prices rise sharply, energy becomes more expensive across the economy, therefore pushes many different costs. Because energy costs feed into many other prices, inflation rises. Central banks such as the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve try to control inflation using interest rate. If oil prices push inflation up, they may raise interest rates or keep rates higher for longer. They do this to reduce spending and borrowing, hoping to slow inflation. But higher interest rates then create a second effect. Mortgage and loans become more expensive. Consumers spend less, firms facing higher borrowing costs, investment slows, economic growth weakens. So the economy can face both high inflation and slower growth, leading to the risk of stagflation. And this is by the chain reaction. Oil price rises, inflation rise, central bank raises interest rate, spending and growth become slow. So an oil shock again can push inflation up and force central bank to tighten monetary policy, which may slow growth and worsen stagflation risk. Focusing on oil exporting countries, this figure shows how oil prices affect the exchange rate in an oil exporting country. When oil prices rise, export revenues increase, improving the term of trade and often strengthening the currency. At the same time, higher oil income can raise domestic inflation, which then affects both the nominal and real exchange rate. The relationship works through several channels: the terms of trade channel, the expectation channel, and the portfolio reallocation channel. In other words, oil price influences not only trade earnings, but also investor behavior and inflation dynamics. The final exchange rate outcome also depends on wider forces such as GDP, monetary policies, stock prices, and uncertainty. With regard to the wealth and the portfolio channel for oil exporting countries, this figure shows when oil prices rise, export revenues increase, creating a short-run wealth effect. This often raises demand for the exporter's currency and support an appreciation in its effective exchange rate. Over the medium to long term, the portfolio effect may also emerge. Oil exporters accumulate larger foreign earnings and then decide where to hold, invest, or reallocate those funds across currencies or assets. So exchange rate movements depend not only on trade income, but also on financial decisions, trade structure, reserve management, and the currency compositions of the portfolio. Here are some oil exporting countries example. The 2014 to 2015 collapse in oil prices created a major macroeconomic shock for net oil exporting countries, especially those heavily dependent on oil for GDP, exports, and government revenue. The fall was driven by more structural demand and supply factors than the temporary 2008 to 2009 crash, so low prices could persist longer. Its impact varied across exporters. More diversified economies such as Canada, Indonesia, and Malaysia were less affected, while highly oil-dependent states faced bigger pressure on growth, current accounts, fiscal balance, reserves, and exchange rates. Some countries softened the GDP impact through a fiscal stimulus, but this worsened their public finance. Countries with larger buffers and prudent policies, such as Norway and Gulf states, had more room to adjust. Flexible exchange rates helped some countries adjusting smoothly, but in others, especially Russia, depreciation brought inflation, uncertainty, and recession. Overall, this figure shows that a country's vulnerability depends not only on oil dependency, but also on economic diversification, fiscal reserves, exchange rate arrangements, and political stability. Another example is Venezuela as an oil exporting country. Venezuela is a strong example of a developing oil exporter whose crisis was intensified by an oil shock in the opposite direction, falling oil prices. The IMF notes that Venezuela's oil price fell to about 47 per barrel US dollar by the end of 2014 and then to about 29 US dollar by end of 2015, sharply reduced oil reserves and worsening shortage and output declines. More broadly, the IMF describes Venezuela as suffering one of the most severe economic and humanitarian crises on record, while World Bank research on the 2014 to 16 collapse notes that the global oil price drop was about 70% from mid-2014 to early 2016. So crisis was worsened by heavy oil dependency and pre-existing policy weakness. This is an example of Russia with the Ukraine war. Russia's situation was after February 2022, diesel prices rose sharply, while the International Food Price Index also spiked. This happened because the war disrupted energy exports, grain shipments, supply chains, and market confidence. Although prices later eased, the graph shows that geopolitical conflict can create global inflation far beyond the battlefield. It demonstrates how war in one region can affect many different industries, food, transport, and household budgets across the world. Here, another slide shows that falling oil prices do not only weaken export earnings and slow growth, they also damage the fiscal position of oil exporting countries because many of these governments rely heavily on oil revenues to finance public spending. A fall in oil prices quickly reduces budget income. As a result, fiscal surplus shrink or turning into deficits. This deterioration then increases pressure on public finance, often leading to higher growth and net public debt. Some countries may borrow more directly, while others may first draw down the fiscal reserves they built up during boom years. So the key message is that an oil price shock can seriously weaken government budgets, reducing fiscal space, and make oil exporters more financially vulnerable over time. Pakistan is a good example as well as an oil importer. In this case, in 2022, higher fuel and commodity import costs helped widen the current account deficit to 4.6% of GDP. The rupee fell by 23.1% against the US dollar, and reserves dropped to about 1.5 months of import cover. This is a classic example of severe impact on oil importers and the chain reaction. So higher oil bill lead to weaker balance of payments and lead to exchange rate depreciation and lead to higher inflation in an oil importing country. Rising oil and fuel import costs worsened the current account deficit. Foreign reserves fell sharply, increasing external vulnerability. The rupee depreciated, making imports more expensive, and inflation surged, hurting households and firms. The crisis was not caused by oil alone, but oil prices were a major amplifier of balance of payment stress. The IMF noted a persistently high import bill pressure on the financial market and eventually faster depreciation as reserve buffers fell. By May 2023, Pakistan's inflation had reached about 38%. An IMF staff said international reserves were only about three-quarters of a month of import. Oil and energy dependency and GDP are closely connected. This figure shows that countries with greater dependency on imported oil or energy are generally more vulnerable to oil shock. In other words, energy structure matters. The same oil shock can damage some economies much more severely than others. The scattered plot shows a clear positive relationship between improvement in a country's net oil or net energy position and a reduction in the negative GDP effects of oil shock. This relationship is especially strong for net oil imports. For example, economies that reduce oil dependency the most, such as Japan and the euro area, or improved their net oil position, such as Norway and the United Kingdom, experience a greater moderation of output losses over time. By contrast, countries such as Switzerland and the US, which made less progress in lowering our import dependency, saw smaller improvement in resilience. The same pattern appears for broader energy dependency. Countries that strengthened their net energy position over time, including Australia, Canada, Norway, and the UK, become much less vulnerable, with the GDP effect of oil shock becoming weaker or even positive in later period. Overall, it shows that lower energy dependency improves macroeconomic resilience. Economies that diversify energy sources, reduce import reliance, or strengthen their net energy position are better able to absorb oil shocks with less damage to output. This table shows a comparison of how an oil crisis affects oil importing countries differently from oil exporting countries. When oil prices jump during a crisis, oil importing countries pay much more for energy imports, face higher inflation, often see slower growth, may suffer a worse trade balance and weaker currency, face a higher risk of stagflation and external deficits. For importers, it's usually a cost shock. So oil exporting countries, on the other hand, usually earn more from oil exports in the short run, but may get stronger fiscal revenue and a better trade balance and see their currencies strengthen. However, they still face risks of over-dependency, volatility, and later instability of oil prices fall. For exporters, it is often a revenue gain in the short run, but with long-run risk. Oil crises usually hurt oil importers more directly, while oil exports may benefit at first, but remain vulnerable to volatility. So in summary, oil shocks are sudden disruptions that push up oil prices and spread through the wider economy. Because oil demand and supply are inelastic in the short run, even small disruptions can cause sharp price rises. These shocks increase production and transport costs, fuel inflation, reduce output, and may create stagflation. Their effects are usually more severe for net energy importers than for exporters. Oil matters because it is a strategic global price that influences firms, households, exchange rates, financial ability, and more. Historical experience shows that oil shocks often trigger wider macroeconomic stress, although the transmission channels may vary across countries and over time. Thank you for listening. In the next session, I will discuss the Iran oil shock in greater details, together with the related economic theories. Thank you for listening. Please stay with me for the next part.